Okay, Kimiko-chan, it's time for an obligatory cat cameo. Everyone knows you're the real star of these reviews. How are we feeling? Hi, I'm LadyJenevia, and you're watching my spoiler review of Dickinson Season 3, Episode 4, entitled This Is My Letter to the World. There is plenty to discuss, so let's get into it bit by bit. We will start off with the shorter character arcs that were presented in this episode, and then we will get into the more lengthy ones. First up, the Dickinson parents, and by extension, Lavinia as well. On a more serious note, it was an interesting experience to listen to Edward's lines about his brother. In all honesty, my initial reaction when that conversation started up was that I did not want to hear it. I don't care about Edward's Confederate brother, not at all. But then when he said that thing about how people shouldn't be cut off from one another by geography, I was a little bit more open to the material. If you look at it as an allegory and expand the idea beyond the regional confrontation of the Civil War, that idea is something that I do feel strongly about in a positive sense. I really dislike how cut off a lot of people are in the global north to the current and historical ongoings of what the global south has experienced, often at the hands of people from the global north. When you're not knowledgeable about other places, you are susceptible to propaganda against those places and the people who live there, which in turn makes you apathetic to politicians waging wars for profit against those places. I'm at the point now where I've come to develop a real disdain for political apathy. Do any of you know who Maurice Bishop is? How about Thomas Sankara? Let me just really quick find some links, so if you would like to start studying up more on global history, you can do so. I'll put them in the description box. Also, if you will remember last week's episode and the brief reference to the French occupation of Vietnam, I'm going to recommend that you follow a user named Luna on Twitter. I will link her as well. She also has a YouTube channel. She's Vietnamese and is constantly posting informative political, historical, and current things about Vietnam, as well as a number of other places, because remember everyone that knowledge is power. On a lighter note though, should we address the fleas? Lavinia buried herself alive, which is so ridiculous. She is very extra, and I found it funny. She's been sleeping in the barn, the cot was infested with fleas, and she brought those fleas into the house. See, I tried to find a way to make jokes about this material without going for the low-hanging fruit, but that's just not in my wheelhouse. Part of me wishes we could expand the episode to be maybe 35 minutes each as opposed to 30, so that we could give Lavinia something a little bit more substantial to play this season. But now that you've been able to watch almost half of the season, I can give more of my opinion without filtering things as much as I've had to do in some of my past videos in order to avoid spoilers. A lot of what Lavinia has this season is exactly this, what you've already seen. It's her being dramatic and extra over her midlife crisis of missing out on settling down with any of the men that she's been with in the past. She's projecting that insecurity onto the Civil War, and this idea that any of those men could have been her husband. It just really doesn't do much for me compared to other stories and character arcs happening this season. I wouldn't say that her season material is completely devoid of anything meaningful to watch, but we just haven't gotten there yet. Getting back to the more humorous side of things though, that line Maggie had about elves, it was so unexpectedly funny for me to experience the first time I watched the season's press screeners. Maggie is a character that does not get much exploration, so this random bit of us learning about this belief that she has, or maybe it's a superstition of sorts regarding elves, the Dickinsons were itching because there are elves and they're upset. I love it. It sounds like a fun idea for a short film, to be honest. And if anyone would like to make that, just send me the link whenever you're finished. I tried to structure this review to oscillate between the more happy and funny material to the more serious and dramatic material. I figured it would allow for a more balanced distribution of the varying emotional tones in the episode. And that means we are taking a turn back to the dramatic. Sue and Austin. I actually really like this scene. Let me tell you why. Obviously, it's a bit of an emotional gut punch, but there's this fascinating nuance to what's playing out in this scene. It's the culmination of the baggage that has accumulated in their relationship. You can really see where both of these characters are coming from in this disagreement that they have as new parents. Sue is a new mother, and there's obviously going to be a lot of emotions wrapped up in that, and she's also in this marriage because she's a woman in the 1800s. There's resentment that comes from being forced into a marriage because of the societal norms that she has to deal with, which is why she's been romanticizing this idea of just running away with Emily. That's what she was saying last week. But if you were to really break the logistics of that down, it would be a nightmare to try to do that. Where would they live, and how would they afford to live under the crushing weight of not only capitalism, but 1800s capitalism? Yuck, I hate it. Anyway, Sue is also feeling the stress of Austin acting up as of late. He's been going out drinking, he's fighting with his father, and then on Austin's side of things, he has wanted this for so long. He has wanted to be a father. That has been a consistent part of his characterization since much earlier on in the show's run. He's finally a father now, but things are a mess because Sue has had affairs. They do not love each other romantically at this point. The woman he loved has left the country and married a new man, and he's fighting with his father. So what you have in this scene are two complex, flawed individuals struggling with their lives and new parenthood. Also, there's just something really sweet and heartbreaking about Austin trying to spend time with his new baby, doing something as simple as singing them a lullaby. It really opens up room for a conversation about fatherhood and about fathers being present in their child's upbringing. I know that some people who watch these reviews that I do of Dickinson don't live in the States or follow the socio-political commentary of what's going on with US politics and US politicians, so I will try to briefly summarize, but we know I'm very long-winded and tangential. Very recently, there was a US politician who took time off from his job because he and his husband had a new baby born through a surrogate. This jump-started a lot of discussions online, many of them homophobic, many of them misogynistic, and just generally unpleasant, about the concept of parental leave, or more specifically, the idea of paternal leave. See, the US does not have a standard at all of offering maternal or paternal leave and guaranteeing that for new parents. And it's important for me to clarify this because a lot of other countries are not living in the Stone Age and believe that parents should be able to spend time with their babies, regardless of how much money they have or regardless of how much money they make in their jobs. I saw some of the discourse around the idea of letting parents, be with their children, and it was very draining to listen to conservative, regressive people be so opposed to people being good parents. Since I already had that whole thing weighing heavily on my spirit when I rewatched Dickinson episode 4, I found it to be incredibly moving to watch this new young father who, despite all of his flaws, loves his baby and wants to be there as a father. Now, I know there are some Dickinson fans who don't like Austin as a character, and that's fine if you don't like him, but I try to look at a lot of fiction beyond just the superficial pieces of what's most easily visible in the story and with what characters are doing. I like to analyze how it relates to bigger issues outside of just the fiction. And I'm not saying I do that for every work of fiction that I engage with, but it's definitely a part of a lot of my viewing experiences. I definitely have a lot more to say about Sue and Austin's joint arc across this season, but I cannot get into all of that right now. It has to play out in more episodes, so we can revisit this topic of discussion whenever it's time to do so. I'm not spoiling anything. Apple, please don't come yell at me. Jumping over to Colonel Higginson now, please tell me you were all as entertained as I was. Did I or did I not say he is the personification of white guilt? The execution of his material, both in regards to writing and acting, is fantastic. I love the way his introduction was put together because on the one hand, you can tell he has all of the best intentions in the world. He's an abolitionist in the 1800s, but he's still ignorant in certain ways. So they've framed this in a more contemporary way so the viewer can better understand and relate to it, of course. There's an appropriation of language, that whole rest in power, can I get an amen? It also seems to address, in a way, this recurring pipeline of the Black community being the one to create new slang and trends, which gradually over time spread to the masses outside of the Black community, where others inevitably reap all of the benefits and profits of the slang and trends that they themselves did not create. I appreciate the historical trivia drop of Henry's abolitionist paper. For those of you who might not know this, there were in fact abolitionist papers back in the day. Between 1827 and the end of the Civil War in 1865, there were 40 newspapers directed at Black readers and were opposed to slavery. The first Black newspaper was called Freedom's Journal, and it operated from 1827 to 1829, but the most notable and influential oppositional newspaper was Frederick Douglass's North Star, which ran from 1847 to 1860 in Rochester, New York. Where is that movie, Hollywood? Anyway, I love Henry's befuddled expression when he's dealing with Colonel Higginson. Higginson is so swept up in his endless cycle of self-correcting that sometimes he struggles to just get to the point. He's brought Henry in to offer him a job, but it takes him a while to inform Henry of this. You know Henry has never met the personification of white guilt before. Also, I so very much appreciate that we once again gave John Brown the shout out. Maybe if you were trying to be an ally and you're not coming with that John Brown energy, then maybe you're just wasting everyone's time. I don't know. Solidarity is a verb. That's another funny line, but it was also an accurate one. That mention of the inherent racism of the English language in that conversation between Higginson and Henry, I was here for that. It's addressing the incalculable loss of their heritage languages, their cultures, and their traditions. By the way, if any of you are diaspora of any kind, living in any place, I encourage you enthusiastically to reconnect with your roots, learn your history. It is never too late. You can start off small, start studying. Knowledge is power. I love that we finally reached the point of seeing more of what Henry's story is this season. You can see how the initial offer is largely to help these Black soldiers learn how to read, but he will also be helping these soldiers work to catch up to standards that they are disadvantaged in trying to achieve. That whole thing where the soldiers are explaining that they are not being paid properly, they're not being given proper uniforms, they're being told they're supposed to be soldiers in the Civil War, and yet they've not been able to do the same weapons training as the white soldiers. These together are an allegory for systemic racism. There are larger structural institutions, policies, attitudes, and so on and so forth that start disenfranchised groups off at a different starting point than those who are born with more privilege. I also really appreciate how they depicted the cultural divide between Henry and the soldiers that he will be working to help this season. They come from different backgrounds and life experiences. In a way, it reminded me of, I forget which season it was, but I have this vague recollection of Naomi Smalls on a season of Drag Race where she was talking about growing up with white parents who had adopted her, and if I'm remembering correctly, I think she also went to schools that had more white students. So when she finally found herself in social situations with a much higher percentage of Black people who had grown up with Black parents and had grown up attending schools with a higher percentage of other Black students, there were certain cultural references that she didn't know. Dickinson is a very white show. We know this. It's refreshing to see when they get it right with characters like Henry. I didn't have time to do a deep dive into checking all of the people that have ever written on the show and who might have helped to ensure this more culturally sensitive and accurate approach to incorporating this subject matter into the show. But season 3 really does feel like the culmination of everything that's been built up over 3 seasons for Henry. One final note about the Henry and Higginson corner of the show's universe. The goofy handshake thing, it was so funny. Excellent comedy. Now, the final point of discussion, of course, the woman of the hour, or I guess the half hour, Emily Dickinson. I have been so looking forward to the fans getting to watch this episode. I was trying to not just give away in last week's spoiler-free review that this was going to be the Walt Whitman Club episode in my spoiler-free review, because I wasn't sure if there would be any advertising and promotional material released that would show that this is what was coming up in episode 4. I was aware of the fact that the general idea of this episode, of there being Billy Eichner playing Walt Whitman, and he's bringing Emily to a gay club. This was something that had already been revealed in different interviews with talent from the show. My policy for those spoiler-free reviews is, when in doubt, don't say it. If I have to question whether I'm crossing a line of revealing too much, I just don't say it. First of all, Emily's dress. The dress. I said last week that I would be bringing it up again. I'm already partial to that type of vibrant blue hue, but everything about the construction of this dress is fantastic. Every time the shot would cut away to someone or something else, and then they would show Emily again, I would just feel re-energized because of how great the dress looked. It makes perfect sense that they used it for the main promo look. Why would you choose anything else? It's so visually striking and aesthetically pleasing to look at. Of course you're going to put it on posters. Moving past the dress, I love the whole concept of the dream sequence in this episode. We see an alternating series of shots of Emily sitting alone, reading a book, and then this dream sequence, which is a really fun, engaging way of mining the depths of Emily's thoughts and feelings. If you take a fictional story in a book, an author can explain, using the written word, these are the characters' thoughts. Here is their internal monologue. Here is an explanation of their feelings. But when you deliver that story through filmmaking, it's a visual medium. Typically, you will rely on the actor's performance, of course. They have to express through their face and body language what is going on with this character internally. There are other technical aspects that will also aid in the storytelling. Is it a close-up shot? Are you editing isolated shots to convey longing looks from across a crowded room? What type of music is playing? But in the case of Dickinson Season 3, Episode 4, this is taking that whole narrative train of thought and feeling and expanding it into its own narrative. Walt Whitman is this well-respected, established writer that the people in Emily's life hold in high regard. So this dream version of him is the one that is delivering the sage wisdom and advice in this sequence that is about exploring her feelings about her art, her life, and about Sue. It's also interesting to compare how much more dramatic Walt Whitman is in this dream sequence than Emily. We can go back to something like Season 2 when Emily had that really dramatic mini monologue about blindness. Let me be blind. You remember that? But this is getting into more of Emily's vulnerabilities. She has insecurities, uncertainties, but Walt Whitman is that part of herself that is cheerleading her. Walt Whitman is that voice that we should all nurture within ourselves of self-love, affirmation. He is the one that is hyping up this part of herself that is considered forbidden relative to the time period, the geographical location, and her cultural background. That's why Walt Whitman's encouragement is what prompts her to loudly declare her love for Sue out loud, keeping in mind that all of this is happening in Emily's mind and her heart. Also, when Walt says, "Is it with Sue that you drain all the pent-up rivers of yourself?" Great line. So good. Emily going to a gay club is, of course, another way of connecting her story and her character journey to today's world. I'm no historian, but I don't think the real Emily Dickinson ever went to gay clubs where she drank cocktails and danced to EDM. I don't want to celebrate this as if the only way to affirm your orientation is to go to a club and drink alcohol. I interpreted it as being more about having a sense of community that Emily doesn't really have in her day-to-day life outside of her mind. It's this really lovely sentiment of being in an environment, of finding friends and acquaintances that understand you, there's this common ground, and by extension, these people support and accept you. I'm recording this a week before episode 4 airs, but I sincerely hope that when this video is published, that all of the LGBT+ viewers feel joy and affirmation from finally seeing this episode play out. Regardless of the fact that the general premise for this episode has already been out and available on the Bird app before the episode has actually aired, I think it's much better than the general premise being explained in interviews, to actually see it play out in full. But let me know what you thought of the episode in the comments, or you can just comment happy celebratory emojis and blue heart emojis. Shout out to Emily's blue dress. Stay tuned because I should be publishing my spoiler-free review of episode 5 very soon. So I'll see you there. Bye. I know you saw a lot of birds today. That was exciting. Do you want royalty checks from these videos, Kimiko-chan? This is free labor you're doing.